welcome back to the Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity. We're talking this hour with Dr. Rachel Harris, author of the book Listening to Ayahuasca, now available. Before we go on into some of the more findings, while you were doing this research, did you find among your peer community that there was a lot of resistance? Did people scoff at this and say, "Oh, there's just a bunch of people doing drugs or whatever"? Or did you find like people, like your colleagues, were like, that could be an interesting area?
I was rather quiet about the whole thing.
Oh, okay, so not too many people.
But I can tell you, my co-author for the study, as I said, is a nationally recognized psychologist, and he was incredibly open. I mean, when we got, at one point, not under the influence, not in a ceremony, not even around a ceremony, I again heard the voice, and the voice gave me, in one sentence, a new way to look at the data analysis. So I called my prestigious co-author, and I said, "Grandmother Ayahuasca says we should interpret the findings this way."
Yeah.
There was silence on the other end of the phone. He said, "Okay, let me look at that." And so when we finally completed the study, I said to him, there should be a third author here, but we did not include her. But there was this, and with the book too, I felt there were coincidences that happened. I felt I had help all along the way.
Oh, really?
And the book goes into a much broader look at what it means to work with this medicine and what it means personally and therapeutically. And I have a lot of quotes from people and what happens afterwards. And the really amazing finding from the study that then persists in all the interviews I've done is that 75% of the people reported an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca.
Oh, really? 75%? Wow.
Now, they didn't all hear an auditory communication, but they felt they could communicate with her in meditation and dreams. They had different, or just intuitively. So there was this sense of having a therapeutic presence. And this is part of what makes this particular medicine unique, is this quality of a personal relationship with the plant teacher that's part of the whole experience.
Right. So what were some of the findings in going through? I mean, first of all, how many respondents or how many people did you interview? Or?
Well, 81 people completed the research questionnaire, and then I've interviewed another 50.
Oh,
and,
wow, okay.
a dozen or so I followed up for many, many years.
Okay.
And these were, ostensibly research interviews, but they morphed into psychotherapy very quickly. And I can give you an example of that. There was
please.
one young woman who came and talked about her experience of the divine feminine and archetype and how this was wonderful for her and gave her a vision of becoming a woman. She was in her mid-late 20s, and I, she went on for a good 10, 15 minutes about this. And then I couldn't control myself any longer. And I said, "And tell me about your relationship with your mother."
Yeah.
And she burst into tears. So there are always levels of work being done.
Right.
And if we only do the archetypal level, then we're missing the psychological opportunity.
Right.
And she had real work to do with her. I mean, if you ask someone about we don't all burst into tears immediately.
Right.
So there was work to be done.
Right.
And I never want to skip that basic family of origin work.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because those are the foundational relationships
it's the
that
foundation,
shape us.
Right.
So, did you find that the respondents had people usually, did they just go to one ceremony? Did they been to several ceremonies?
The criteria was that they had been at least to one ceremony in North America. So some people were members of one of the syncretic churches.
Oh, yeah.
And so they reported they'd been to 200 ceremonies.
Wow.
But, the churches meet every 2 weeks. And these are, these churches they're from Brazil, and there's one in New Mexico and 2 connected in Oregon, and they have the legal right to use this indigenous tea as a sacrament. So it's purely as part of the religious ceremony, it's a sacrament.
Right. And was that common with the people that experienced the ceremony? The ceremony was always a very sacred space for people?
I was surprised that pretty much everybody was in a ritualized setting.
Right. Right.
Now, this is now, the data was collected 7 years ago.
Yeah.
We don't know how it's changing.
Yeah.
And this medicine is meant to be used in a ritual setting with a shaman present.
Right.
And the kind of energetic healing that goes on, the shaman sort of orchestrates.
Right. Now,
And I want to add, and provide safety for the participants. That's really important.
And I actually wanted to ask about that. Did you find any issues with the shaman that people worked with, or is there any
You're talking about rape. Let's just be really clear about it. Yeah.
But not just rape, but there can be other manipulations too.
Right. Because most of the people were responding about their North American experience. I didn't, but I did interview a few people who'd had bad experience in South America.
Okay.
And one woman in particular has been talking and lecturing and writing about really being targeted by a shaman. He mixed in datura into the ayahuasca, and she was not quite totally conscious for a few weeks, and it was part of his being. It was he used datura like a rape drug, and she was at his mercy. And I wanted to be very blunt about this and say, yes, there are real issues of manipulations around the usual story of sex and money.
Right. Yeah. I mean, wherever there's power, there's opportunity for
These
corruption.
are old stories mixed in with spiritual experiences.
Right. How did you find most people found the ceremonies? Because it is an underground thing.
I didn't ask that.
Oh, you never asked
that. I mean,
that.
there are a couple of things I didn't ask. I didn't ask if people stopped, if they stopped smoking cigarettes. And I'm sorry I didn't ask that, because there's findings at Hopkins that people who have a complete mystical experience with psilocybin are able to quit
cigarettes,
which is really hard to do.
Yeah. And I know they're doing a lot of research now at NYU with psilocybin as well for the therapeutic benefits.
Right.
As you were compiling the research and looking at stuff, were there any surprises along the way, some things that you didn't expect?
Well, the biggest surprise was the ongoing relationship with grandmother ayahuasca. That was really the biggest surprise. And the book only really talks about the research in the first couple of chapters. Most of the book is a real exploration of how ayahuasca is being used. And I had to do a chapter on mediumship. Because it wasn't a surprise, but it was difficult for me to write about it in a way that made sense to me. But many people are reporting working with spirits. And of course, even asking the question, are they real, is not quite the right question.
Right.
It's really saying, what's happening here? How is this working? And is it therapeutic for you? Part of the assumption is that it's therapeutic for the spirit. I didn't know how to do research in that area. But I explore that.
I know people who can do research in that area.
Oh, good. Because somebody should be.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's a chapter on what's happening in the brain that allows for the therapeutic changes that happen. And some of the findings is that the architecture of our brain, I mean, the way the neurons are connected and how we structure our personality, that all softens and begins to change. And there are new connections, new neurological, it's literal, neurological connections can be made. And so that opens up the opportunity to make conscious choices. We're all wired from early childhood.
Right,
but as an adult, we can look at our experiences differently and make different decisions about how we want to be in our lives.
Right. Our past doesn't necessarily have to shape our future, even though it may influence it.
Doesn't have to.
Right. Were there any really remarkable breakthroughs that you learned about that?
Well, these are inexplicable. Some people did report a lifelong depression has lifted. Another person reported she'd been on antidepressants for 20 years, the age of 18 to 38.
Wow.
And had done numerous ceremonies, but she started microdosing. This is sort of a hot topic these days.
Yes.
So she would take just a few eyedropper drops under her tongue of ayahuasca in the morning. So she had no effect no psychedelic effects whatsoever.
Right.
She lived her normal life. She did this maybe twice a week. and
No more antidepressants.
no more antidepressants.
Oh,
And she has a diagnosis of major depression. This is not a light,
Right.
I need a little help. This was
Right.
lifelong depression.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you find that everybody had a strong experience when they went into ceremony?
After my good experience in Costa Rica, I organized a group of my nearest and dearest friends to return.
Uh-huh.
And they were all experienced in many different spiritual disciplines.
Okay.
And one couple sat through 2 ceremonies, bored to tears. Nothing at all happened. And they drank twice as much as I drank.
Wow.
And nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. And I saw this about a year ago in a circle where an experienced woman, again, took an extra cup. You can ask for a second cup. And absolutely nothing happened. It's a long night to sit there, with nothing going on.
Yeah.
It's the first time that ever happened to her. And then she reported driving home. All of a sudden, she burst into tears and had sort of a therapeutic conversation with a sibling she'd been having trouble with. She had to pull off the road, cried, talked to the sibling in her, in the car, in her imagination.
Right, in her imagination.
And it changed her relationship with that sibling. So even though nothing happened in ceremony, look at what happened after. It was so valuable for her.
Right.
And how do we explain this?
Right.
We've no way.
So we just wanted to be clear that, it's not everybody has these mind-blowing, amazing experiences, but that doesn't mean that there's not some therapeutic benefit that happens after the ceremony.
Right, but I also want to talk about the downside. I was just at the MAPS conference, and one of the researchers from, I think, Brazil reported on, I think he had 5 cases of psychotic breaks as a result of an ayahuasca experience. And, I remember talking with a Western shaman who'd been in a mentorship for a few decades. And she reported at the retreat center in Peru, someone had a psychotic break. And I excitedly asked, well, how did the shaman treat it? He said, we shipped him out. We sent him back to the city to a hospital. So there's no magic for everything.
Right.
And that was a naive question on my part, an assumption.
Right.
So we have to be realistic. There are risks.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And going back to how you mentioned before about the idea of screening, that it is important to maybe ask some questions.
Oh, absolutely.
Before a ceremony to see.
Right. Make sure the reputation is sterling.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Believe it or not, I think this is our last break of the show. Everything goes by so fast when we have such interesting guests. So everybody, please stay tuned. You're listening to the Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, and we'll be right back.